Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be returning to some armour in the form of Airfix's 176 scale vintage classic Buffalo. For this build I'll be trying out some new techniques which I haven't done on armoured kits before, and I'll also be upgrading it and converting it to the LVT-4 Amtrac using some 3D printed parts I've designed which I have for sale on my Colts, the link to which I'll leave in the description. So without further ado, let's get into this one. To start with, I give all of the plastic and 3D printed parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any dirt or oil from them, before I then started cutting out the various hull parts using my Tamiya side cutters. Once cut out, I sanded away any of the flash or excess sprue from these parts. This kit has been around for quite some time, so there is a fair bit of flash, and the bottom of the hull especially required a fair bit of cleanup using a knife. As is typical for an older Airfix kit, the panel lines on the upper hull and driver's cab are all raised, so I decided to try using my Tamiya scribing tool to score them in. I probably should have been a bit softer and careful as I did not achieve very straight panel lines and they were all a little bit too deep. Once done, I then carefully glued the very curved lower hull to the left side of the hull using some Revell Contact to Professional, followed by the engine and driver's cab bulkhead, and then the right hull side. The cargo compartment was then slid in, which fitted very easily, and before the sides fully dried, I then squeezed the ramp into place and did not glue it so that it could be moved. There is also a floor piece for the ramp with some raised lines, as well as some more side panels with what appears to be a compartment which contains the ramp's raising and lowering mechanisms. Next I added the hull roof, which also has the mudguards and driver's cab moulded into it. I did consider 3D printing an interior or even just some drivers to put into place, but decided to keep my upgrades limited to what is more visible on the outside. The side plates were cut out and cleaned up along with the top panels for the rear boxes, and then they were glued into place as well. In general, the hull assembly was pretty fiddly, but after being cleaned up, the parts fitted together pretty well, though this tooling definitely has a lot of flash, and the circular mounts for the ramp were incredibly thin and brittle, and sadly later on broke. To soften the rather overdone panel lines I'd scored, I decided to then run some Tamiya Extra Thin over them to soften the effect. The Extra Thin was also run over all of the part joints to help produce a stronger bond, and to fill in some of the gaps. Moving on to the slow and painful process of assembling the running gear, I cut out the wheels, sprockets and idler, and then assembled the idler halves. The idlers were then glued to the hull sides, followed by all of the main road wheels. An outer hull piece then locks all of the wheels into place, but before I added this part on, I decided to rescore the raised panel lines. Though now that I've looked at reference photos a bit more closely, I think it would have actually been better if I'd left them there to replicate the weld marks, as they look more accurate than the recessed ones I ended up adding. Once the panel lines had been scored, I glued the two return rollers to the top of the outer panels, assembled the sprocket and glued it to the hull, and then I finally glued the outer segments to the hull and wheels. A fair bit of fiddling was required to get them to line up, but in the end I managed to do it. The first set of resin tracks I made were slightly too small and fragile, so I had to redesign and print them out. In the meantime, I started adding the smaller accessories such as the bow gunner's mantlet, headlight covers, the hatches, and the kit's included tying points. Moving on to the resin parts, I clamped my benches with some bulldog clips to straighten them out, and in the meantime I added the base pieces and arms for the 30 and 50 cal machine guns using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. The 30 cals were then slotted into the arms and they fitted perfectly and can naturally pivot. However, the 50 cals would have required drilling part of the hull roof for them to slot in, so I ended up just gluing them into place. A spare resin 50 cal was used to replace the thick ugly plastic blob that's included for the kit's bow machine gun. Since in reality the benches were foldable, they only had some very fine framework connecting them to the hull, which would have been very fragile. So instead I decided to glue some spare bits of sprue to the bottom of the benches, and then glue those to the hull where they wouldn't be visible. The ramp was really loose fitting to the rather fragile holes that hold them into place, so I tried applying some CA glue into them to make the fit a bit tighter, which worked for a bit, but unfortunately they still later broke apart. The kit had quite a few small gaps which I had to fill in with some Vallejo water-based putty, and I also took the chance to fill some of the worst of the scribing panels which I'd done too deeply, or any of the scratches I'd added by mistake. Some vague plastic bumps were moulded to the hull for the grab handles, but I ended up replacing these with resin ones. For this build, I experimented with using some Mr. Primer 1500 mixed with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner to thin it down, and then dabbing this in several thin coats using a brush onto the model to create some armor texturing. This would create some faint imperfections and dimples that are common in armor, and would also make this vehicle's large flat areas look a bit more interesting. To my knowledge, the LVTs were made entirely of rolled armor plate or metal sheets, so unlike a cast assembly, these imperfections would be very subtle and probably not really visible at 1/72nd scale in reality, but hey, this was a lot of fun, and I do not think it looks too different from the actual vehicles. By this time, my second attempt at the resin tracks had been printed out and cleaned up, and this time they fitted a lot better, but still needed a few small repairs. I then added the last of my extra details, such as the vision slits onto the cab that are absent in this kit, along with some missing hooks and handles, the rear convoy lights, framework near the ramp, and I also replaced the hollow cylinders on the mudguard since the kit ones were just nubs of sharp plastic. And with all of these additional resin parts added, the kit was ready for some priming. I went with some Vallejo Gloss Black Primer mixed with roughly 50% acrylic flow improver to 50% primer to make airbrushing it on a lot easier. I gradually built the primer up in many thin passes, aiming to keep it slightly wet looking but not too runny, until eventually the whole kit was a shiny uniform black. Once the upper surface was primed, I repeated this process on the underside, and then set the model aside for 24 hours to allow the primer to cure before painting, which is what we'll be covering next time in part 2. Thank you very much for watching this build video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And if you have any friendly advice you'd like to give me, please leave it down in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I spend making these videos. So without you guys, this wouldn't be possible. If you want to help fund the channel, I'll leave a link to my Colts, eBay and Patreon page in the description below. Part 2 should be coming out sometime next week, where I'll cover painting this model, but until then, as always, take care and model on.